Welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 4. I'm Bob Judson. I'm the host for this podcast, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. Whether you're a new joiner or a seasoned listener, then I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that we provide. The personal stories, the thematic episodes, and of course, the fantastic guest interviews. If you've been with me since the beginning, then I'm enormously grateful for your loyalty and thank you so much. If you're relatively new to the show, then I really hope you like it, and I hope you find all of it interesting and some of it hopefully useful to you. Please subscribe on whichever channel it is you're using, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast platform. That really helps us boost the show and get it over the hills on the algorithms. So if you can do that for me, I would be enormously grateful. But without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. It's almost the end of my RAF journey, and I thought I would continue that without too much interruption, really, from my last episode talking about the closure of my time as Assistant Chief Defence Staff Operations to talk about what was my last tour in the Air Force as Director Joint Warfare in what was then called Joint Forces Command. At the time I went there, I didn't actually know it was going to be my last job. I was kind of increasingly conscious that it might be, and I talked about that quite extensively in the last Personal Stories episode. But I was still firmly in the kind of, no, it's probably not. It's a good job. I was taking over from a guy that was a good friend of mine, Greg Bagwell, who was moving on to bigger things. He was going on to be promoted and be the Deputy Commander of Operations at Air Command. And so I was moving into it at a kind of good space, I suppose. But I was conscious as well that the timing for it was poor, in that upward and onwards from those kind of jobs, the timing is very, very important in terms of when other slots are becoming available. And so that was looking quite challenging because a number of the key appointments had just changed over. And therefore, I thought I could probably be completely out of sequence for this in what I knew was going to be basically an 18-month appointment. That was the way the arrangement had been set up. So I was kind of vaguely aware that that was not going to be helpful. But at the same time, I moved into it working for Richard Barons, who'd been my boss in the previous role as ACDS Ops. He was a 3-star then and had been promoted, become a 4-star, and gone to command Joint Forces Command. So I was working directly for him. I was a member of the Joint Forces Command board. I was part of the senior team that was in there. And so it was a real privileged appointment, no question about it. It was it was lots to it. Very, very different pace of life to being in the Ministry of Defence. As I kind of rapidly discovered, it was, whereas I'd been rushing around my hair on fire virtually every day, I think in the ACDS Ops role with lots and lots of different things going on and lots of interaction at the political level and cross-departmental and all that sort of thing. This, although it was a joint appointment and I was the Director of Joint Warfare, so I was working across all 3 armed services, it really was very much kind of tied to the services in that sense, and much less MOD focused, although certainly not without it. And actually domestically that worked quite well for me as well, because what I ended up doing was making a case for, and unusually in these circumstances winning, a case to stay in my flat in London and effectively reverse commute every day to go out to Northwood, which was perfect because I was already there. It saved a move. I didn't want particularly to move up to Northwood. My wife was working for BAE Systems still, so it actually suited us really, really well to stay in the flat. So I was delighted that proved to be a good option. And then the reverse commute obviously was completely painless because I was going out when everyone was coming in and coming back when everyone was going home. So in terms of chaos on the transport system, it really wasn't a problem at all, and that made life quite straightforward. And it was a different kind of job in that I didn't have the same kind of weekendy commitments and things that were going on the operational space that had been in the ACDS Ops role that were very much making it a very demanding, all sort of weird times of day and night, and often weekend interruption type stuff. Much less very highly classified work and all those kind of things, which just slowed the pace of life quite a lot. And that was good. But at the same time, there was a lot to it. There were lots of different moving parts to what I was actually trying to do. I was responsible for a number of kind of important things. So we were responsible for the entirety of the top tier exercising program across all 3 services. So pulling that together and trying to make sure that we provided the best training we possibly could across the Army, Navy, and Air Force at joint level. They obviously do a lot themselves internally, but bringing it together at the joint level was what my team did. We were responsible for the entirety of the lessons process, so the lessons identified and hopefully some of them at least learned, and looking at how that worked. We probably were one of the most significant things in terms of the way the work played out was I was responsible for the development of what's become the Joint Expeditionary Force. It was called that at the time, but it's actually really become an entity now. And also a thing called the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, which was a tie-up much more closely with the French. So we used to have quite a lot of work directly with my French counterpart to work on that, and that was a real pleasure to work with him. Go out to France quite regularly. He would come over to UK quite regularly, and we were looking at building up that capability. Because obviously of my kind of joint head, I was also responsible for some significant meetings, and one of those was the build-up and development of the Queen Elizabeth class carriers, which obviously is, although it's a Royal Naval asset, was clearly very much seen in the joint space as a critical joint capability. Not least because the aeroplanes flying off it, and the same with HMS Prince of Wales now, are RAF and RN, a mixture of the two. So that brought it automatically into the joint domain, and it clearly has opportunities to be used more broadly across all three services for obvious reasons, just in terms of a big piece of sovereign real estate. So as we were developing that capability, and at that stage, Queen Elizabeth was still in build in Rosyth. Prince of Wales was basically chunks of metal that were about to start being put together, so it wasn't even really started. And I was in a lot of the key meetings that were going on at the 2-star and at the 3-star level. So I was chairing the 2-star level organization for that, and attending the 3-star level one with the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff military capability. And fascinating to do that, not least because I actually got to go and visit Queen Elizabeth in build up in Rosyth and walk around this huge warship as it was being put together, have a good sense of what was going on, be able to actually ask a few probing questions, challenge a few things, get them to think differently about one or two things as well, I think. And all that was important, and so that side of the job was a real pleasure to do. I had some fantastic people working for me. It was lovely also to be at Northwood in Joint Forces Command. Very different to be in that kind of away from, it was sort of a suburbia really for London, but it's still away from central London and away from the hustle and bustle of all of that, and working back much more in uniform and being out and going, visiting lots of different organizations in uniform to go and see what was going on, not least on the training side and so on. So that was completely different to the Ministry of Defence, where very largely the work was in a suit, occasionally putting on uniform, but pretty rarely, and a lot more Whitehall warrior type activity. Whereas this was definitely not that. So in that sense, it was a breath of fresh air, because I hadn't done a job like that for a while. Actually, I'd come back from America into the ACDS ops role, and so there'd been a pretty big space before between that, and before America. Obviously, I was also in MOD. And so I'd actually not really been doing anything around in the UK in the sort of joint space for a while. Actually walking around and going and genuinely understanding to a good level what our capabilities were and where we were heading and how that was all shaping up. So that side of it was fascinating. There was also a bucket load of change going on across MOD at that stage, and in fact, the job that I was run for but ultimately didn't get, that was building up and looking as though it was going to be formed, was the Director General of Joint Force Development, which was bringing together a whole range of different additional things underneath a new 3-star appointment, joint 3-star appointment that I was the RAF's candidate for, but ultimately it was the very good friend of mine, Duncan Potts, who got the job as a naval officer in the first incumbent. And that ultimately was what sealed my exit, because at that point I knew, having been run for that role, I was very, very unlikely to be in a position where I was going to be run for another joint job. I really needed to do a single service job anyway, having spent so much time in the joint environment. The previous single service role, so specific Air Force role had been commanding RAF Coningsby. And that was back in 2006. And here we are now in 2013-14. So, it was firmly looking as though I needed to think about what else was an opportunity. So at the same time as doing all this busy stuff, I was focusing a bit internally back into the Air Force. I had a bit of a hospital pass while I've been ACDS ops in terms of doing some of the stuff that the Air Force would throw my way, not least service complaints, which is at that kind of level. You get to hear on behalf of the Defense Council, the top level panel discussion around people who are raising individual grievances. I had pretty much managed to argue that I didn't have time to do that while I was ACDS ops, and I didn't, to be fair. But I had to pay the piper a bit when I was Director Joint Warfare, so I ended up doing quite a lot of those. And that took me back into the Air Force a little bit, which was no bad thing. I was still obviously a member of the senior leadership team, so I was able to be quite actively involved in some of those Air Force level discussions that were going on as well. And there are some kind of, I guess, some nuggets that flow from some of this. I mean, the service complaints thing is a good one because I really did get a good sense of how that whole process worked. And to be honest, it didn't work that well. And I made some pretty strong suggestions that what we should be doing is looking at making some of this, retired officers opportunities to come in and hear these things rather than actually tying up serving officers' time, which it occupied a lot of time. And some of the time you'd get the paperwork to hear a particular service complaint because it had gone through various levels up to that point, and there'd been lots of different things that had happened. This would be a lever arch file or more full of paper that to do the individual justice that you're hearing the complaint for, you actually have to read all of that, and you have to make sure you've gone through everything, you understand it thoroughly, and then you go into the panel to kind of adjudicate on whether or not we're going to uphold this complaint or whether we're going to reject the complaint. So it was really important to get those right, and some of the things we saw weren't that edifying in terms of the way the services had handled people, and particularly my own service, the Air Force, which was obviously where I was hearing complaints from. We had a couple of instances where, frankly, we should have done better by our own people, and they were completely justified in complaining that they hadn't been treated right, fairly, rightly, correctly, whatever. And we upheld their complaints, and that obviously for them must have been a huge relief. But at the same time, obviously, you think, why on earth did it ever get to this space? It shouldn't have done, because these were quite straightforward things that could have been dealt with very differently much earlier on down the process, instead of taking months, in some instances years, to actually come to a process. Much like when you look at the legal system in the UK, and I suspect across the world, really, some of the time these things take far too long and occupy people for very substantial amounts of time, cost a lot of money, cause a lot of frustration, cause a lot of grief, a lot of difficulty for the individual that is the complainant or the accused or whatever it happens to be. So we could do better by doing some of that more efficiently, that's for sure. And it also, because the job was a little bit less pressurized, I suppose, was an opportunity to actually go out and be quite clear-eyed about some of the things we were doing in terms of capability development and so on, and be reasonably vocal in the fora that I was part of. I talked about the carrier already, but obviously the Joint Forces Command Board was another one of those where we were dealing with everything that was within Joint Forces Command. And it was a great opportunity to turn around and have a real voice that helped to shape some of the future of what was going on in defence. And I was proud to do that. It was a real privilege to do it. But the job itself, there's not a huge amount that I think would be of great interest on the podcast. So I'm not going to belabor that. I think the interesting part for my kind of personal journey was where it did take me in terms of what now, because I mentioned the 3-star appointment I didn't get. I was now firmly in the space of, okay, so I'm riding the kind of stay in the military horse, and I'm riding another horse at the same time now that is basically think about exiting. And when I didn't get that 3-star role, it was then some pretty serious conversations with the Chief of Air Staff about, okay, what else? What else is an option here? Because the reality is I really need to do that single service job. There isn't a single service 3-star job coming up for at least probably 2 to 3 years. And I've got less than that in this job. So there's going to have to be some gap filling done somewhere, somehow, if we're going to make that work. I was floated loosely for a job in Naples as a NATO 2-star. to go out and be the plans officer out in Naples, run that section. We took that quite seriously because I actually went out for a visit with my wife to go and see whether that would have worked. It would have been quite challenging domestically with her still in a job back in the UK, but we were kind of minded we could make that work. But ironically, that then disappeared completely off the radar because the requirement changed and it became a land requirement as opposed to a joint requirement. So it had to be filled by an army officer, and so that then disappeared in the senior appointments committee process. So we're kind of back to square one again with okay, what's the next thing? And Chief of the Air Staff at the time, Air Chief Marshal Sir Andy Pulford, was super helpful. He was really, really keen to keep me, wanted me effectively as a pawn on his chessboard, I think, to be fair, where I was going to be an option for him to do stuff with. But he knew and I knew that actually some of those options in terms of the short term were probably involving almost holding posts, which at that level was a challenging thing to contemplate, and industry placements maybe, that kind of thing, to then keep me in play to potentially compete for jobs downstream. And when I look back on it now, I'm sort of quietly confident that had I said yes to that, I would probably have got a third star, and I'd probably have had one more role in the service. But at the same time, by the time I actually did leave, ultimately off the back of the joint warfare job, I was 53, and had I stayed, it would have been probably a year, 2 years of waiting, no guarantee. Might have got promoted, might not have got promoted. If I hadn't got promoted, I was absolutely at risk of being the one thing I didn't want to be, which was a bit bitter and twisted at the very end of a very long and very successful career. And I really didn't want to be in that place. If, on the other hand, I had been promoted, then I would have gone into a job where I would have probably been there for at least 3 years. And so suddenly you're talking about I'm now leaving at 58, 59. And I'm then going, that potentially is a bit too late to be starting to do anything else. And you can argue, and some would, that why do you need to do something else? Just retire at that point, or slide into a kind of much slower pace of life, and do some other stuff that is less consuming. And I just, that wasn't me. That wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to be in a position where I was still going to have a chance to go and do something different, experience something different, build a bit of a second career. And that ultimately was I suppose, the real catalyst for a decision which I came to mutually with the chief, which was, sir, thank you very much indeed, but actually, do you know what, I'm going to leave. So ultimately I ended up leaving on directed early retirement, as it's called, where they decided, right, we don't have a further job for you, therefore we're telling you have to leave, and that's a process within the military. I won't bore you with all the admin side of that here, but let me leave on good terms at 53, with kind of everything that goes with the kind of reflection of my time in the service. So the joint warfare job, from the point that decision was taken, was a bit of a mixed bag for me, because I was preparing to leave, but at the same time filling a really busy, challenging appointment. And I suspect anybody in business or elsewhere that has been in a similar place will identify with how difficult that actually is to do. Because certainly initially, people didn't know I was going to leave. I hadn't declared my hand publicly. It was the private conversation was there with senior people that was going to happen, and I was now going to go. I think the first time it really, the cat got properly out of the bag was I went and did a thing called the Career Transition Workshop, which is a part of the resettlement process. And one of my own staff came in on the same Career Transition Workshop and looked at me and goes, "Hi, sir, what are you doing here?" And and I think that was a bit of a surprise to him, because he didn't appreciate that up to that point that I was kind of on my way. And I was very, very conscious, and I think I achieved this, that I wanted to continue doing a good job right up to my last day in the job. I know I'd had a bit of space after completing the joint warfare job before I actually finally left, which was, the Air Force were very good about that. I'll come back to that point in a second. But up to the time that I handed over to my successor, I was wanting to be in a position that I was doing the job full throttle right up to that time, and that I was handing it over in the best possible state, with everything as tied off and complete as I possibly could, in the way I'd done with every other job I'd ever done. So, I wanted no difference in that sense, even though this was a seismic shift. At this point, by the time I was going to leave, I'd been in the Air Force for 34 and a half years. And it was a big deal. Suddenly I'm now stepping away from that and going to a wholly new life. And that comes back to the Air Force being quite kind about it, because it would be perfectly possible for the service to actually say, you finish your job, you hand over, and then you have your month of terminal leave, and then you're out. That's it. And which is pretty brutal, really, in terms of preparing you to go and do something totally different. So the services tend not to be like that at that level. And I was certainly very lucky. I had nearly 6 months, which was a sort of agreed transition path where I was still being paid by the military, but obviously was preparing my ground for leaving to go and do some other things. And I did some bits for the service in that time, particularly around single service things. One of the things I did, which was one of my very proud memories, actually, was pinning wings on some graduates going out of the flying training system. And I've touched on this previously, I think, where that was almost my last act in uniform, and it was an absolute privilege to do it. And I vividly remember that myself, getting my wings from a two-star officer way back in 1982, and then actually to be doing it in 2015, where I was actually doing it to a bunch of other people graduating from Linton-on-Ouse, where obviously wings were being presented at that stage. That was tremendous. That was a really, really lovely thing to do. And I had a few other things like that. And then decided, okay, well, that's kind of just about to be the end. I was desperately sad to see the people go, or to leave the people behind, I suppose, better said. If I miss anything about the services when I look back now, almost 11 years on after leaving, it's the camaraderie, it's the people, it's the kind of the culture and the ethos, all the stuff that goes with that. There's lots of stuff I don't miss because there was some grind and difficulty and all the rest of it. But there's no doubt that the way of life aspect of being in the military and going up the track in the military to become a pretty senior guy was just amazing. I mean, I look back on it with nothing but fondness. And having made the decision to go, I obviously did agonize about it a little bit. If I made the right decision, is this going to be all right? How's it going to work? I'm going to talk about the kind of next steps on, and suddenly being unemployed. I'll do that in a separate episode. But it was a big decision to do what I was doing, and I thought, I look back on it now and I go, was it the right decision? 100% yes. 100% it was the right decision. It was the right time for me to go. I went with a smile on my face, a phenomenally good view in the rearview mirror, nothing but brilliant memories, the incredible good fortune to literally be able to say I had enjoyed every single job I had done in the service. Now, I wouldn't remotely suggest there weren't some ups and downs and some highs and lows and some challenging bits, and both on a personal level and definitely on a professional level, and that would happen in any job. But I mean, I really did think that every single job I'd done, I had actually, I'd enjoyed it, and I'd watched continual progression, and and by any measure had done pretty well. So I was very, very pleased about all of that, and exiting in that kind of way for me personally was very, very important. I've watched too many of my friends over time who have left it a bit late to leave, and they've gone with a bit of a chip on their shoulder, either that they didn't get promoted when they were hoping to, or they didn't get a job they were hoping to get, and they've been, whereas I promised things which weren't then delivered. And I just was really, really happy to not be in that space by the time I stepped away. And so that was great that I was in a position to be able to do that, and to kind of close out my career in an interesting job with some interesting people doing some important things for defense as a whole, but perhaps without the same frenetic, crazy pressure that had been in the ACDS ops role. I think if I'd been leaving from that job, life would have been a bit more challenging, to be perfectly honest, because it would have been really quite hard to separate, transition and getting ready to actually leave and doing some resettlement and doing some preparation to go and do something else from work, just because there wouldn't have been the time. The time was just not there in the diary to be able to do that. So it'd been really hard. So I was quite glad to have a role that was a little bit less pressured, a little bit more straightforward to be able to step away from that from. I'm kind of conscious when I started this personal stories journey a bit more than 2.5 years ago now, that I said I wasn't going to do a chronological view of my service career. And of course, that's exactly what I've done. I've done basically a tour by tour view of everything I've done. And I'm sure that as I roll forward now with some more personal stories, what I'm going to do is dip backwards and forwards into things that are across my career, because there's definitely some things I've skipped over a bit and I've been too light touch on. This might be one of them. I've been very, very light touch on what I did in the direct joint warfare job. And part of the reason for that is I think when I look back on it now, it's a job that kind of passed by relatively quickly for me. And, I did 18 months and it went in a bit of a blur. And there's lots of things I remember doing the kind of big nuggets that I've highlighted here, but the actual, the really seismic big moments weren't there in the same way as they have been with some of my previous jobs. So, from that point of view, that's why there's less content in terms of my final tour. Didn't make it any less important to finish well and do all of that. And I hope it's been interesting to you to listen to my story along the way of my Air Force life. There's clearly a story after the Air Force, and I will pick that up, and we'll be carrying on with that over the personal stories to come. And as ever, thanks very much. If you're listening this far, I really appreciate it. And I really hope you've enjoyed this whole journey, this episode in particular. If you have, please think about sharing it. Please think about doing that, subscribe or follow or whatever it happens to be in the platform you're on at the moment. If you're on YouTube and you haven't yet subscribed, please do, because it makes a difference. Big time makes a difference to the way the algorithm works and helps with the distribution of the podcast. So I need to get the subscriber numbers up, and that would be really, really helpful. Following on other platforms, just as important as well. Sharing it, though, most importantly, get other people who you think might value some of this, might find it interesting. Please get them to at least have the opportunity to listen by sharing it, and with some kind of comment if you feel it's appropriate to do that. Let me have some feedback direct, either way, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm always interested, and what you think of the kind of show and the way it goes so far. That would be great too. And last but not least is that financial thing. As I say, not necessarily on an episode like this, but on some of the other episodes. If you're finding what I say valuable to you, and generally, or genuinely, you're feeling that actually this is information that is useful, then please think about giving me some of that value back and doing some support directly financially on Patreon to become either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. Won't cost you a lot of money, but makes a big difference to me. Either way, I will be back again very soon with a guest episode next week is the plan. In fact, the next couple of weeks should be guests, and then some thematic stuff that's coming up after that as well, and then another set of guests that are coming on beyond in terms of racking and stacking of the plan for the future. Hugely grateful for your listening. Thanks ever so much. If you're listening or indeed watching, all the very best. Speak to you soon. Bye now.